Hello, everyone, and welcome to Orientalism History. Today, we're joined by Professor James Gelvin, a distinguished scholar of Middle Eastern history, professor at UCLA, where he's been a faculty member since 1995. Professor Gelvin is renowned for his insightful work on the modern Middle East, particularly in the areas of nationalism, social history, and cultural history. His books, such as The Arab Uprising, What Everyone Needs to Know, have become essential reading for anyone seeking to understand the complexities of the region. Our conversation today centered on some of the most important developments in the modern history of the Middle East, including the rise of nationalism, the impact of the Sykes-Picot Agreement, the implementation of the mandate system, and the eventual independence of a number of Middle Eastern countries. These movements not only reshaped borders, but also identified aspirations, identities, and the political landscape of the region to this day. That and much more. Thank you so much for joining me today, Professor James. We'll be discussing World War I in the Middle East specifically, and let's get right into it. Maybe we can just start off with a broad overview. What was the importance of World War I for the Middle East?
Well, World War I was probably the most important political event in the history of the Middle East. I mean, you go into the war and you got to get out of the war, and the social relations are pretty much the same. Economic relations are pretty much the same. But in terms of politics and diplomacy, it's very important to set up the modern Middle East. There are four main reasons why it is the most important political event in the history of the modern Middle East. The first one is that it marks the demise of the Ottoman Empire and the emergence of the state system in the region. If you look at the Middle East before World War I, the Ottoman Empire ruled, at least juridically, even if it didn't have all that much control, it ruled over the territory that is Anatolia, now Turkey, the territory that is the territory of Greater Syria, which is Syria, Lebanon, Palestine, Israel, and Jordan. It ruled over Mesopotamia, as they called it in those days, that is Iraq today, parts of the Arabian Peninsula, and Egypt as well, which was an autonomous province of the Ottoman Empire. By the early 90s, there was no more Ottoman Empire. Turkey was an independent state which ruled most of Anatolia. The Arab states were in the process of formation, but for the most part under the control of the British and the French as administrators. Egypt experienced a revolution in 1919, and then it got limited independence in 1923. And the Arabian Peninsula was, for the most part, united under the leadership of the Al Saud family, founders of what would become Saudi Arabia. So we see a breakup of the Ottoman Empire and the establishment of a state system. So that's the first result of the First World War. The second result of the First World War was the spread of a variety of nationalisms throughout the region. There was no longer an Ottoman Empire. The Ottomans had tried their own brand of nationalism, but now there was no political umbrella to hold Arabs and Turks together or Arabs together with each other. And so what we see is the emergence of a variety of nationalisms. We see Arab nationalism, we see Syrian and Greater Syrian nationalism, we see a variety of local nationalisms, there's Egyptian nationalism, and so on and so forth. All these things emerged as a result of the breakup of the Ottoman Empire. The third result of the Ottoman Empire is the Zionist movement during the war received the blessing of a great power. Zionism is Jewish nationalism. And during the war, the British issued what was called the Balfour Declaration, saying that they viewed with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jews. Nationalisms come and go all the time, and they don't survive because they're a better idea or because they're a truer representation of what the population wants. They survive because they receive foreign assistance, they're wealthy, charismatic leadership. And in this case, Zionism didn't go the way of dozens and dozens of other nationalisms, which just have a brief efflorescence and then fade. But the British support actually enabled it to eventually, in 1948, establish a state. Then the final result of the First World War was a coup d'etat that took place in Persia, Iran today, and the consolidation of an Iranian state. We look at how the state was in the 1920s and how it is in the 2000s. Obviously, it's an Islamic republic now, but the state has not given up on any of its power. It was able to penetrate the population totally. It was able to spread its influence much greater than it had before. And so basically the consolidation of a Persian state was the result of the First World War and the coup d'etat that took place after the First World War.
Great. So it sounds like a lot of very geopolitical implications, but maybe we can take a step back and talk about the war itself and why the Ottoman Empire decided to actually join the Central Powers, which were Germany and Austria-Hungary. Obviously, that decision had a large and long-lasting impact. Can you just talk a little bit about why they decided to join that side of the war versus the other side, or why they decided to join in general?
Well, historians disagree about this, so there's really no real answer. And I can give you a bunch of theories. The first one was that there was a great deal of German influence within the ruling elites of the Ottoman. The Germans were training the army, for example, and the Germans were very much involved in Ottoman military education. So there was that aspect to it. The second thing is that the Austrians, who had problems with the Ottomans in terms of claims in the Balkans, wanted the Ottomans to on their side in order to be able to smooth over these various problems. Then the Entente powers, the rivals to the Central Powers, basically didn't do very much to attract the Ottomans into their alliance, probably thinking that the war would be over too quickly for the Ottomans to mobilize and make much of a difference anyway. So there are various theories as to why they definitely did. But once they did, the Ottoman territories became the basis for negotiations among the Entente powers, who were trying to figure out what pieces of the Ottoman Empire they would claim for themselves in the advent of an Entente victory. So, everyone in the Entente powers, even Greece and Italy, had claims on Ottoman territory. But of course, the British, the French, and the Russians, who basically were the Ottomans' traditional enemy in the region. And that leads us to a final reason why the Ottomans undoubtedly joined the Central Powers, was because they would probably never join in a alliance system that included the Russians in it.
So were there kind of secret negotiations and treaties that were discussed and agreed on by the Entente powers, and kind of how important were those?
Well, those are two very different questions. There were definitely agreements that were reached between various Entente powers, dividing up the region. The thing about these agreements, though, is that they really had very little effect on what was going to go on after the war. And there's a number of reasons why they didn't have much of an effect. What was going to go on. Basically, one of them was that the Russians dropped out, so therefore it didn't have to be appeased. In 1917, there was the Bolshevik Revolution. So the Russians not only didn't press their claims to Ottoman territory, but they actually published the secret agreements, embarrassing the French and the British immensely. So there was that aspect of it. The other one was the Americans entered the war. And American terms for this entry in the war were Wilson's 14 points. And 14 points called for an end of secret diplomacy. So therefore, there's no need, argued many of the Arab nationalists, to honor these various treaties dividing up the Ottoman Empire. And the treaties themselves were mutually contradictory. I mean, if you look at these treaties, you read them all and lay them side by side. Palestine, for example, the territory that is currently Palestine, gets promised to international control, the French, an Arab state or states, and the Zionists. Okay, so there's no way of squaring that circle. So obviously what had to go on afterwards was a renegotiation of these agreements. Now, you hear a lot of things about the Sykes-Picot Agreement, that being the groundwork for all the problems that the region has. The idea that the French and the British divided up the region into these small territorial units and basically screwed over the Arab nationalists. The Sykes-Picot Agreement was never implemented. And it wasn't implemented for a variety of reasons. Basically, it was a dead letter. So why is the Sykes-Picot Agreement so important? Why do people keep bringing it up? Well, it's a whipping horse for a variety of reasons. In the 20th century, for example, people looked at the Sykes-Picot Agreement to say, well, this is why the Middle East is so fragmented, that there is no real big Arab nation. It's because the British and the French divided it up. Then with the emergence of groupings like Al-Qaeda and ISIS, it was, again, the perfidy of the British and the French dividing up Muslims. And Muslims should be united into one single, as ISIS puts it, one single caliphate without these mini-states. And the whole idea of the mini-states, according to Al-Qaeda, was to keep the Middle East fragmented and weak. So there was that aspect to it. And then finally, in the most contemporary period, it's an example of blowback. Look at what we did. We did this and we got screwed over by it. I mean, for example, we financed the Mujahideen in Afghanistan. And then all of a sudden we get Al-Qaeda out of that. We create these states, these mini-states, and they're very unstable. Well, the instability of the Middle East has very little to do with that. And the instability is a very sort of strange instability. The state system in the Middle East has held. I mean, it's been one of the more stable state systems in the world, actually. There's only been one real territorial change since the 1970s, and that was the two Yemens uniting. But besides that, there really hasn't been a territorial change except on the Israel-Palestine front, and that hasn't been implemented yet either anyway.
Great, interesting. You mentioned something briefly about how Russia was part of those agreements. This is not something I had ever heard of. What concessions were given to Russia or negotiated with Russia before the revolution happened? What parts of the Middle East were they quote unquote promised?
Well, the idea for making agreements with the Russians was they were afraid that the Russians were going to drop out before the war was over, and so basically they wanted to give them a toy worth fighting for. To the bitter end. The Russians, of course, did drop out anyway and renounce the secret treaties that they signed. But the big prize for Russia has always been, since the 18th century, has always been Istanbul, has always been the Turkish Straits, has always been a breakout into the Mediterranean. This is something that was promised them in the Sykes-Picot Agreement and various other agreements as well, that they would have ownership of the Turkish Straits and Istanbul. They also wanted to internationalize the holy sites in Jerusalem. And so they were promised an internationalization of parts of Palestine as well. So those are the two main toys that were given to the Russians. And the British and the French divided things up among themselves elsewhere.
Interesting. You mentioned pan-Arabism and a big Arab country. My understanding was that's kind of why the Arab Revolt happened. What was the Arab Revolt? How important or unimportant was it?
Well, the Arab Revolt, the importance of the Arab Revolt has been very much exaggerated. The whole idea of the revolt was that the Ottoman Empire had declared jihad against the Entente powers. The British were the rulers of more Muslims than any other state in the early 20th century. Controlled territories as now India and Pakistan. And so they were very worried about this. And so what they wanted to do was have a counter jihad. Oh yeah, you think you're bad? Well, we're badder than you. So the idea was that they found somebody who was willing to work with them, Sharif Hussein, a descendant of the Prophet, who was the ruler of the Mecca and Medina. And they basically promised him guns and money and the ability to establish an Arab state or states afterwards. So that was when he deployed one of his sons, Emir Faisal, along with T. Lawrence, who is, again, a very overrated historical figure. And they formed the right flank of a British army that was moving up from Egypt all the way up, and eventually they reached Aleppo. And at the end of the war, the Arab army that was part of this whole operation was in control of what's now Syria and established Faisal as king, only he got overthrown by the French in the Battle of Maysalun, and the French took control over all of Syria, including Lebanon as well. So it was a very short-lived thing. But the story of the Sharifians, of this family, is a very interesting one. Okay, so Emir Faisal was declared king of Syria, and he gets booted out by the French. As soon as that happens, his brother, Abdullah, begins marching from Mecca to avenge his brother. And the British told him to, wait, hold on a second, wait at this basically caravan stop in what's now Jordan, Amman, and we'll figure this out. So the British decided at some point to divide up the territory that was their Palestine mandate into two parts. One part that was on the western side of the Jordan River, one side on the eastern side of the Jordan River. That was Transjordan, and they gave that to Abdullah to rule. And a descendant of Abdullah has ruled ever since. And now he had a son, and then his son had a son, and so that one is the current ruler of Jordan today. So the British still had a problem, what to do with Abdullah, or what to do with Faisal, who was kicked out as king of Syria. So what they decided to do is they took three provinces of the Ottoman Empire, Basra, Baghdad, and the northern province of Mosul. They put them together, and they created this thing called Iraq. And they gave the throne to Faisal. And Faisal and his descendants ruled in Iraq until 1958, when a revolution removed them. So we have only one of the Sharifians left, and that was Sharif Hussein. He got booted out of Mecca and Medina by the Sauds, who established Saudi Arabia, united Eastern and Western Arabia. He ended up on Cyprus and died, as I say, with a broken heart.
Interesting. So that family, they led the Arab Revolt, but now they're still ruling to this day in Jordan out of, the three countries which at some point they ruled. So the Brits made a promise to the Arabs, as far as I understand, that there'd be this Arab state. What other promises did the British make to other groups or other or other countries?
Well, the British were desperate actually in the war. And, they made promises to, for example, the Zionist movement to the Jews. They also made promises to the people who would go on to found Saudi Arabia, for example. They put them under a veiled protectorate, a protectorate that wasn't publicly announced. And they gave them guns and gold, if only they would stay away from the British possessions on the Persian Gulf and aim their weapons at the Ottomans. The most important one was the promise that they made to the Zionist community. And there's been a big debate about as to why the British did this. I mean, obviously, this is something that would come back to haunt them in the future, and they couldn't have anticipated it. So there are a couple of theories as to why the British would want to appease the Zionist movement or win over the Zionist movement to the British side. On the one hand, it was strategically important to control the area of Palestine, which was just north of the Suez Canal, which was a major lifeline for the British Empire. It connected Britain to India. So if they had a group of allies there, which they assumed that the Zionists would be, they would be able to protect it. One of the other reasons was that they wanted to appease both the Russians and the Americans. The Bolsheviks, for example, a lot of them were of Jewish ancestry, Jewish heritage. And basically they thought that nobody could really believe this Bolshevik stuff. So these people, all we got to do is scratch them a little bit and, the Jewishness will come out. And the Americans, Woodrow Wilson was not particularly trusted by the British. He wanted peace without victory before they entered the war on the side of the Entente. But two of Wilson's top advisors were important figures in the American Zionist movement. So they thought that they could shore up American support that way as well. So that's another theory as to why they supported Zionism. For his part, Lloyd George discusses these in his memoirs, and he discusses 9 other reasons why they came out with the Balfour Declaration, which is a bit overkill. Some of these he could take more seriously than others. For example, he said that, Jews being a colonized people, we've been for the freedom and independence of colonized peoples throughout the world. That's what the Entente stands for. Sure, except maybe in Ireland and India. The one that probably is true, though, is the one where he says in his memoirs, look, we were desperate. We were looking for any straw that we could clutch at. This was just another straw, and, it couldn't, and it might even help us. So why not promise the Jews a home in Palestine?
You said that they may have gone on to regret that. Why would they have regretted that? Were there things that happened during the mandate system that made them regret this decision?
Well, the British were in control of Palestine, which is the west bank of the Jordan River, the west side of the Jordan River, and they could dispose of it as they chose to. Basically, they were on record as supporting Jewish immigration, but of course the indigenous inhabitants of Palestine didn't particularly like that. And so in the beginning, they supported Jewish immigration. Then there was the Great Rebellion that took place between 1936 and 39. Which was devastating for the Palestinians. And one of the reasons why the Palestinians ended up with the Nakba, with the catastrophe of 1948, was because so many of Palestinian young men in particular had been imprisoned or killed or wounded in the Palestinian uprising of 1936 to 1939. So in the meantime, the British were fighting a 3-sided civil war. Palestinians were fighting against Zionists and fighting against the Jews. Zionists were fighting against the Palestinians and against the British. And the British were trying to keep a lid on all this, and they weren't able to do that. So in 1947, what they decided to do is, okay, the League of Nations gave us the mandate for Palestine. The League of Nations no longer exists, but there is a successor organization, United Nations. So what we should do is we'll just dump this problem on the United Nations and let them deal with it. We're done. We're through. And so that's when the British decided to get out, and the General Assembly of the United Nations voted for the partition of Palestine, which basically led to first a civil war and then an invasion of Palestine by Arab armies to try to overthrow the Jewish state.
So it sounds like World War I played a key role in creating the quote-unquote Palestine problem. Maybe we can talk a little bit about the mandate system. I think you mentioned the British mandate for Palestine. What was the mandate system, and what was the local population reaction to the mandate system?
Well, the mandate system, very interestingly, was something that was unique to this period. It had not been tried before, and it came about as a compromise between the Americans on one side and the British and French on the others. The British and the French had no problems with establishing the Middle East as colonial possessions. where they would have permanent control over the region. The Americans, on the other hand, since 1896, its foreign policy had been based on this notion of an open door. In other words, that everybody would have equal trade preferences in the territories that were opened up, for example, China in the 80s, that everybody would have equal competition. And the reason for that, of course, is because by this time, America was the world's foremost industrial power, and so could outcompete all its rivals. So how do you square the circle? No imperial preferences on the one hand, and the idea of having colonies. Well, what you'd have is temporary colonies. The idea that the British and the French would control these Class A mandates, as they call them. They would prepare their charges for the rigors of civilization, as they put it in the Charter of the League of Nations. And in the meantime, they would control the economies, they would control the politics, they would administer these territories as they wished. What they couldn't do was to set up tariffs on outside powers to basically trade with these territories, because that was something that the Americans didn't want. Now, the Americans were very interesting because they actually created a great deal of difficulties at the end of the First World War with the British and the French. As the price of entering the war, Woodrow Wilson promoted his 14 points. And as I said before, one of those points was no secret treaties, which, of course, the British and the French had entered into. But there were other things as well. For example, that the territories that were under Turkish control, as they put it in the 14 points, would be on the road to independence. And basically, again, nobody would have preferences there. And that the desires of the inhabitants of the region would be taken seriously. They would be weighed alongside the desires of the colonial powers. So this was the first thing that was violated. For example, at the end of the First World War, Syrians took this thing seriously, the 14 points, and they put together what was called a General Syrian Congress, which met in 1919 and came up with a resolution. And the resolution was that, number one, Syria should be united and independent, no mandate. If they had to have a mandate, they would go to the Americans. This was probably the worst misreading of American imperialism in history. They saw what the Americans did in the Philippines, for example, and they said, hey, they built schools and hospitals and that sort of thing. And then they left, which the Americans did not do. So if we don't want a mandate, but we have to have a mandate, we want the Americans can't do it, we want the British. And if the British can't do it, under no circumstances will we tolerate the French. So we want independence, we want unity, if we have to have a mandate, an American mandate. So what happens? They get split up, they get a mandate, and they basically are under a French mandate. Everything they didn't want to happen. And so this is sort of one of the aspects of how the region evolved.
Interesting. And Iraq was also a mandate, and Iraq was the first mandate to get independence.
Yeah,
how were they able to be the first mandate to be independent?
Well, it's actually interesting because Iraq was probably the least prepared area to be independent. I mean, fundamentally, you have territorial notions of Syria and Lebanon, but Iraq was a brand new territorial notion. And basically, as I said, was the unification of three provinces by the British for their own purposes, actually. The British imposed a king on Iraq. King ran a referendum, and it was something like 98% people supported him. Which was better than Saddam Hussein ever did in terms of his referendums of support. Obviously, it wasn't a free election, but he received the support and he became king of Iraq. And the British saw Iraq not as a responsibility as the League of Nations saw it, but as a burden on the imperial treasury. Britain was broke after the First World War. So it decided what it could do is it could keep indirect control, have treaties with Iraq, and not have to administer the territory themselves. And so in the late 1930s, Iraq got its independence in 1936, became the first of the mandated territories to receive its independence, the only one to receive its independence before the Second World War. And the irony of it is, as I said, is probably the least prepared for independence. And the whole idea of the mandate system was to prepare the charges for independence.
So you mentioned that, diplomats and foreign nations plotted the boundaries of current states in the region. Does the fact that these boundaries were defined by Europeans rather than Middle Eastern people, does that make them illegitimate in your view?
Well, this is the argument actually that Joe Biden gave when the United States was involved with ISIS and trying to get rid of ISIS. And he said these boundaries are artificial anyway. And what we should do is we should establish states that were according to people's primordial identities, either religious or ethnic or whatever. Well, the problem is that number one, this was tried and done by the British and the French, who tried to set up states. I mean, at one point, Syria was divided into 6 different states that would represent, the Alawite community in Syria, that would represent the Druze community in Syria, and that sort of thing. That didn't work out very well. The idea that the states are illegitimate is all state borders are illegitimate. Tell me a state that basically has a border that isn't artificial. All state borders are artificial. The American border is no less than any other border. I once wrote that, and a very angry Australian wrote to me and said, Australia's borders are not artificial. Yeah, well, there could have been 4 or 5 states in the territory that's now Australia. And, the islands off the coast. Who determines this stuff? So all states have artificial borders. But the thing that's made these borders actually stick has been the fact that, number one, the international system hates the overthrow of states that exist. In other words, when Saddam Hussein tried to take over Kuwait and ingest Kuwait into Iraq, the international community put up quite a fight about it and basically freed Kuwait. Other problem with this argument that these are artificial states and that's why they're unstable is the boundaries have held. And that, we could see the importance of national identities now, which is 70 or 80 years later, in the fact that, look at the Arab uprisings. People say, well, the Arab uprisings demonstrate the fact that people have an Arab identity. No, they don't. Everybody had the main omnipresent symbol of the Arab uprisings was a national flag. Egyptians held the Egyptian national flag, Kuwaitis held the Kuwaiti national flag, Libyans held the Libyan national flag, and so on and so forth. They were working for the overthrow of their governments and the democratization of their governments. They weren't working to establish some big Arab state. So these governments right now are absolutely legitimate. You talk to somebody from the Middle East, and they know very well what their nationality is, and jealously, regard it. They, Syrians and Lebanese, who basically they tell jokes about each other, and who's smarter people and more clever, Lebanese or Syrians. So, I mean, this is the way in which these national identities have.
Yeah, and pan-Arabism has been tried, right? Like Jamal Abdel Nasser tried to unite Egypt and Syria. There's been unification attempts with Yemen and so on, and it doesn't last and it doesn't work. Maybe we can talk a little bit about some of the countries that we haven't talked about. So Turkey obviously played a big role in World War I. Can we talk a little bit about how Turkey came to be, and specifically the Battle of Gallipoli, I think it's pronounced. Mm-hmm. Can you talk a little bit more about that and its impact on how Turkey became an independent nation?
Yeah. Well, the Gallipoli was important for a couple of reasons. Besides the fact that it made Mel Gibson into a star, it was important because it also made the victorious general of the Ottoman forces, Mustafa Kemal, who later adopted the name Ataturk, father of the Turks. It made him a national hero. The British decided that they were going to launch a knockout blow against the Ottomans, conquer this peninsula that's south of Istanbul, and march up to Istanbul and knock out the Ottomans from the war. And it turned out into a bloody slugfest, bloody by even World War I standards. Thousands and tens of thousands of troops died, particularly on the Ottoman side, and on the Entente side, they were mainly from Anzac, Australia and New Zealand troops. And this is something that is a very, very important part of Australian national identity, the Battle of Gallipoli. But anyway, Mustafa Kemal became a hero because he was able to prevent the overthrow of the Ottoman government. And at the end of the war, the British and French and the Italians and the Greeks occupied parts of Anatolia, present-day Turkey. And there was resistance on the part of the population of Anatolia. They set up committees for the defense of rights to kick out the foreigners from Anatolia. And so the last sultan of the Ottoman Empire basically sent Mustafa Kemal out to central Anatolia to put down this rebellion, but he took charge of the rebellion. And in an extraordinarily bloody and long war, he took over the government throughout all the Allied troops that were there. Particularly noxious to the Turks was the idea of the Greeks being there. The Greeks were inspired by the idea of reestablishing the Byzantine Empire and taking over Istanbul. Turks, as they now were able to throw all the foreign troops out of Anatolia and establish the Republic of Turkey. And the imprint of Mustafa Kemal was, and that first founding generation was very, very strong. They had to make up a nationalism. Of course, Turkey had never existed before, so they made up a nationalism. There was staunch westernization that took place, secularization that took place. They adopted the Western calendar. They transformed the language. They made Turkey into a modern nation state, in other words, which was ruled by secular principles. And that lasted all the way until the 1980s or so, when there began to be a shift that took place in Turkey. And then with the PKK party began to put on more and more of Islamic symbolism. So this is how Turkey began to evolve in its own way. I mean, Turkey had the basis to do it. The late Ottoman Empire was a particularly strong centralizing state, and so therefore Mustafa Kemal didn't really have that much of a difficulty. If you want to look at somebody who had difficulty in putting together a state, that would be Reza Khan before it. He was a military leader in Persia, and Persia was basically caught in the 19th century between two imperialisms, British imperialism in India and Russian expansionism in the north. And so, therefore, had none of the benefits of colonialism, building of infrastructure and ports and things like that, railroads, that colonial powers, for all the evil that they did, they actually did leave infrastructure behind. And the dynasty that ruled the Iran, Persia in those days, was very, very weak. So at the end of the war, the British had occupied Persia, wanted to get out. Again, the expense was too much, but needed somebody to protect British oil fields in Persia. And so what they decided to do was to give help in some form to Reza Shah, who later became Reza Shah, to overthrow the monarchy in Iran and to establish himself as ruler of Iran. And so he built from scratch this whole new set of infrastructure, of rule, of administration in Iran that didn't have the blessings, didn't have the benefits of what the Ottomans had. So this was quite an accomplishment. And everybody models themselves on what models are available at the time. I mean, now, of course, everybody takes a neoliberal model. In those days, people had, for example, a model of state building that was based upon mainly the German model and state building that was going on at the time. So both Mustafa Kemal Ataturk and Reza Shah borrowed from, for example, the Bolsheviks, borrowed from the Nazis, borrowed from the fascists of Italy, and centralized control very, very strongly in their own hands, using these as models. This was also the era of the Great Depression, so starting in 1929. So what these leaders had to do is to figure out a way of consolidating the economies of these states. So they took a very statist approach to the economies, just the opposite of what we have going on now. As a matter of fact, you could say that Turkey's economy since 1980 reversed direction. Same thing with the Iranian economy as well, although the vast majority of the Iranian economy remains in government hands.
Interesting. So there's kind of two countries we haven't talked about yet, which are Egypt and Saudi Arabia. Can you briefly talk about their roles or those geographies' roles in World War I and how those modern nation states came to be as a result of that war?
Well, the biggest British base in the Middle East was the Suez Canal and the Suez Canal zone. The second one, by the way, was Palestine. But the biggest base was the Suez Canal, and this was the base from which they launched their attack on the Ottoman Empire. And the Arab Revolt, as I said, was the right column of the British army. At the end of the war, the British had pretty much alienated everybody. The British took over, occupied Egypt in the 1880s, and they were fairly well ensconced in Egypt and pretty much loathed in Egypt as well as foreign intruders. And during the war, things got even worse because there were price controls on Egypt's main crop, which was cotton. There was high inflation. There was even famine in Egypt as food was confiscated to feed the troops. At the end of the war, all you needed was a spark to set things off, and that spark was provided by a group that was led by Saad Zaghloul, who was one of the real heroes of Egyptian independence. He petitioned the British to go to the Paris Peace Agreement, peace talks, and to represent Egypt there for Egyptian independence. And for his efforts, he was thrown in jail and then exiled. And Egypt exploded as a result of this. And this was the famous 1919 revolution. Now, the revolution was eventually put down by the British, but they established a commission to figure out what they could do to hold on to Egypt. And the best that they can come up with was this idea of giving Egypt partial independence. In other words, Egypt would be theoretically independent, would be able to join the League of Nations. But in reality, the British controlled the defense, the British controlled foreign policy, the British controlled Egyptian policy towards minorities, the British controlled the Suez Canal. Wasn't real independence. Making real independence for Egypt was the goal of every government until it was finally accomplished in 1956. So from 1923 until 1956, Egypt only had this sort of partial independence from the British. In terms of Saudi Arabia was a brand new state. Egypt, of course, was a consolidated territory, an autonomous province of the Ottoman Empire, 18th and 19th centuries. But Saudi Arabia, the unification of the Arabian Peninsula was something that was brand new. And this unification took place as a result of the efforts of Abdulaziz ibn al-Saud, a member of the guy who established the Saudi dynasty. And he put together a army with a group of people called the Ikhwan, the brothers, who were basically sedentary Bedouin. They had been settled in agricultural villages, and they were fighters. And so basically he conquered the Arabian Peninsula, threw out Sharif Hussein, as I said, and established the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. Now, there's a very interesting story about what he had to do in order to do this. I mean, people worry about for example, ISIS, which was trying to set up its own caliphate, for example. The state system has a way of taming any sort of movement that wants to become some of an outlier. At a certain point after the Iranian Revolution, the Iranian government considered themselves not a nation state, but a vanguard of a global revolution. Well, the global world does not recognize vanguards as a player. And so if the Iranians wanted their money back from the Americans that froze their assets, they had to go through the United Nations. They had to participate in the state system. And this is the same thing that happened with the Saudi Arabians. When the Ikhwan started raiding into Iraq, the British who were there in Iraq at the time responded furiously and began bombing the troops, the Ikhwan. So Abdulaziz figured out what he had to do was to get rid of the Ikhwan, which he did. Made Saudi Arabia, negotiated the boundaries between Saudi Arabia and the states around it. And then the Ikhwan also were very, very puritanical, back to basics Muslims. And so what they wanted to do was to convert the Shi'is of the eastern province, which is about a third of Saudi Arabia, convert them to Sunni Islam or get rid of them. This is where all the oil is. And so Abdulaziz pretty much knew you couldn't do that. So the jihad against the unbelievers, the Shi'i unbelievers of Arabia was called off because of the necessity of calming that area of the eastern province. So Saudi Arabia became a nation state like any other nation state. And as I said, the world community is a way of taming any state that has bigger aspirations and being just a nation state.
Why didn't Abdulaziz and the Ikhwan go into Bahrain and Qatar and UAE and conquer those areas?
That area was the area of the trucial states, and they had treaties with the British. The British had established protectorates there. See, most of those states in the region received their independence in 1971 when the British announced the policy of east of Suez. They weren't going to keep military bases anywhere east of Suez. Ibn Saud had, as I said, an alliance with the British. And the idea was that he wouldn't touch their possessions there. He wouldn't touch their protectorates. But he had no such agreement with Sharif Hussein. And so therefore was able to march on Mecca and kick out Sharif Hussein.
Interesting. Great. Can we talk about the borders? So you mentioned the Saudis would go north and raid Iraq and across the border. What is Churchill's hiccup?
Churchill's hiccup is very interesting. It's an apocryphal story. It may not be true. It probably isn't true, but it's a great story. It shows just how these guys arrogantly set up these borders on their own. I mean, at the Cairo Conference of 1921, the British decided, okay, we got to figure out what to do with Transjordan and where to draw the borders. And this is when they decided to create the state of Transjordan, which later became the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan. So the story goes that one day Churchill took out his straight edge and began drawing the boundary. And Churchill was a guy who loved his mutton and he loved his whiskey and that sort of stuff. And so he hiccuped. This was after lunch. And so there's this indentation on the Saudi-Jordanian border, which there's no river there. There's no mountain range there. There's no political reason for it. It just happened. So to this very day, Jordanians refer to this as Churchill's hiccup. And it just goes to show, just the arrogance of these guys who drew borders where they had no knowledge whatsoever of the populations involved.
Great. Maybe we can just wrap up with, what are the lessons you think we can learn from World War I in the Middle East, if any?
I think that we've taken a lot of negative lessons from World War One, and the most important one is the idea of these states being artificial, and the idea that these borders are artificial as well. Maybe they were in the beginning, but over time, and this is the most important thing, over time, populations have been grown accustomed to the states that they live in. They in their national legal system, they're involved in their national educational systems. They are conscripted. They have certain culinary dishes that they consider to be their national dish, that sort of stuff as well. So these boundaries have held, and the international community, as I said, is very loath to the establishment of some sort of super state that will destroy, the state system as it now stands. So they held, and they will continue to hold in the future. Now they fragment from the inside. I mean, there's total chaos now in Syria and in Libya and in Yemen, and you have pretty much warlord rule in all three places. But overall, the state system is held firm. Nobody's talking about the destruction now of any of these places, except maybe the Emiratis would like to see a hunk of Yemeni territory chopped off and given to an independent movement so they can set up a base there.
Great. Thank you for that. Thank you so much, Professor James. It's been a pleasure talking to you, and we really appreciate your time and your.
Thank you.